distressing.
Exactly. Actually had a conversation with Peter Hitchens from Britain set up, and the audio from his wasn't coming through on the software I was using, but it was coming through on my headset, and so I had no idea the sound wasn't working, and the
Yeah.
only thing they could hear was the sound from like my microphone, like my earplugs to the mic, and that was all they could hear. So I had to like turn it like this so they could
Oh
hear it.
my God. Are we already on the live thing?
Yes, I believe
Oh,
so.
then I
Uh,
won't tell you a really distressing thing that happened when we were having a bunch of talks at one of our conferences, videoed, um, and a lot of them were just destroyed. That was one of the worst days in my life. That most of the talks at a conference did not have usable videos of them. So
oh God, that's awful.
I totally empathize with your plight. That was horrible.
Yeah,
Horrible.
I can definitely understand, especially for a conference because you take all that time and money to set it up and get everything working, and then
We planned it for a year. We had some world famous scientists speaking at it. And the videography company, which was a professional company, I will not mention their name, but they forgot to record the audio for 8 of the 11 talks.
wow, wow,
That is, I mean, unbelievable. So that was a life changing experience for me. Anyhow, yeah, we had a talk by one of our members who was perhaps the most brilliant physicist alive today, and he's a member of our organization. And his talk is not. We don't have a recording of it. Anyhow,
Roger Penrose.
yeah. He's a. By the way, you're going to introduce me, right? Is that who
Yes,
I?
yes. This is random person on the screen speaking. Professor Barr, thank you for coming on and having a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before you get started?
Okay, so I just retired as I've been a professor of theoretical particle physics for I guess decades. Okay, and I just retired. Hold on a second. I just retired so I could devote full time to an organization that we founded 4 years ago called the Society of Catholic Scientists. And I was the odd man out, so I ended up being the president of the society. Um, yeah, and so that turned out to be a really a full-time job. So I spend my so-called retirement working harder than I did when I was employed. But as I said, I turned 67 this coming weekend, and I've been for since I got my PhD in 1978. I have been a theoretical particle physicist, mostly doing research, but then in later years doing teaching as well.
Cool. Thanks again for coming on. I appreciate it. You wanted me to start by giving you ecology. Uh,
Right.
sure. So I am a naturalist. I believe that the natural explains everything about the world better than any supernatural or theological explanation. So I think that I'm a moral realist, so I do believe morality is objective. I think that the foundation of my epistemology is the principle that you must be able to differentiate imagination from reality to be able to be justified in holding a position. And so I think that you need evidence proportional to the claim to be able to do that. So, for example, I use novel testable predictions as my criterion to be able to differentiate imagination from reality. And if you
I'm
don't,
sorry, you use what?
novel testable predictions,
Oh,
science.
novel testable. But actually, what I was more interested in is your ontology.
So,
Like, what
naturalism,
do you
just
think?
materialism, just matter and energy in motion.
Okay, so you're a materialist. Very good.
Yes.
All right, that helps.
Cool. So, would you mind telling me some of the reasons you believe in a God? And because I'm an atheist materialist, obviously, and so I don't believe in a God. Would you mind telling me some of the reasons you do believe in a God? Then I'd like to tell you my thoughts on those positions and hear your thoughts on my thoughts on your position.
Good. Okay. Now, but before I tell you my reasons, I just want to say that, in a sense, I'm an old guy, and I've had many debates in private with people on all sorts of subjects, and I've discovered that. So I don't want this to be a debate because I think those are largely a waste of time. And the reason I've discovered they're a waste of time is that the real reasons people believe things, if you're talking about their philosophical viewpoint, worldview, or their political views, their religious views, their moral views, nobody really believes has a viewpoint on fundamental issues because of a set of simple facts that are easily stated and a number and sort of deductive proofs, some syllogisms or deductive proofs are really only get you very far in mathematics. Even in the physical sciences, the way we establish the truth of things is not by deductive proofs. It's by, as you probably know, most philosophers of science talk about the inference to the best explanation, or abduction. So the reason people believe things is not because of a set of simple proofs. And so when you ask someone, why do you believe? Why are you a socialist? Or why are you a moral realist? Or as you said, there's something where we have some common ground. Or why do you have this philosophical view? The reasons lie deeper than some set of easily stated arguments. And I just want to get that on the table, because any deductive arguments start with axioms or premises. And the real interesting question is why people hold those premises, why they have, and the reasons for those are usually rather complicated and deep and hard to get across in a simple way.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I don't want this to degenerate into, so here's my proof of the existence of God. You read my book or parts of it, and I don't like people talk about proofs of the existence of God.
Oh yeah, just to jump in for a minute there, like I think the reason most people believe is usually emotional. So, for example, I was a Christian when I was in high school before then, and the reason I stopped believing wasn't because I heard some profound arguments from Richard Dawkins. It was because none of my prayers were ever answered, and so I don't.
Well, you won't get profound arguments from Richard Dawkins. No, I'm not saying emotional. I'm talking about, G.K. Chesterton in one of his books. And I can't reproduce this because he was much more clever than I, but he was saying something like, if you would ask an ordinary man, why do you believe in civilization? He would look helpless, and he'd flounder, and he'd say, look, there's that piano over there, and look, there's those books, and he wouldn't know how to express it, because with something like that, it's not just emotion. There are deep reasons, but the reasons are hard to articulate often, and they're complex, and usually involve lots of different evidence and arguments that all sort of work together in point in some direction. So the real reasons are hard to articulate and can't be laid out like a mathematical demonstration. That's all I'm saying. And with that, I'll prologue. I'll tell you some of the reasons I believe in God. And I just want to say that to really explain why I believe in God would probably take days and days. So at the level of a couple of reasons have to do with the fact, I've always actually seen the existence of God as almost self-evident. Even since I was quite small, it's very hard for me to put myself in an atheist frame of mind. I'll just admit that. It's all the other doctrines of Christianity that I had to work through that were not obvious to me. But the existence of God was sort of self-evident to me. It's opposite of my father, my late father, who was of Jewish ancestry. And for him, he had no trouble with the doctrines of Christianity. It was the existence of God that was the big point. And it wasn't until he was 79 years old that he finally was baptized as a Catholic. But so I'm like the complete opposite of him. But the thing that most impresses me, and it's maybe hard to articulate, I regard the existence of the world, the fact that there is a real world at all, as requiring some cause. And so that to me is a very deep conviction that there must be some ultimate cause of being, of reality, of the reality of the world. A second, also powerful, but it was not, this came later, is a conviction that there must be some cause or explanation of why the world is orderly. And that is strengthened for me by science, because science is, that doesn't depend on anything science has discovered. That the world is an orderly place is obvious. It's not just chaos, totally chaotic and haphazard, and things happening and completely, there's order to the world. But as I've studied physics, that argument has seemed ever stronger to me, because I now, as a theoretical particle physicist, one cannot help but be impressed by the incredible depth of the ideas that undergird this order. The order of the world is not some trivial order. It's not built of Tinker Toys or Legos. But the architecture of the universe is based on extremely subtle, rich, deep mathematical ideas. And to me, that suggests that there's a mind behind all of this. That if it takes brilliant minds to even understand the structure of the world, to understand the laws of physics. And it strikes me that they must be the product of a mind. There are other arguments, other reasons too. And there's one that I won't go into because I've already spoken too much, and I should let you talk back to me. But there's a certain way that I believe that there must be. I believe that there has to be a mind that is a perfect, infinite mind that understands all things. This we can talk about later, possibly, but a deep conviction of mine is that everything makes sense. That everything can be understood. That the world, that there's not dark areas that are sort of irrational and beyond. Everything is intelligible. Everything that exists is intelligible, makes sense. The world makes sense, in short. And I think if the world makes sense and everything is ultimately intelligible, there must, corresponding to that, be an active understanding that makes sense of things, that understands them. And that active understanding is God. That is, God is the infinite, perfect, complete active understanding that grasps all things and understands all things and knows all things. And that, to me, I believe that such an active understanding exists. And that maybe is more. And then, of course, I also am a moral realist. And I guess another thing is a sort of a negative reason. To me, the only plausible alternative that I have heard of or the only coherent and attractive alternative to theism is materialism, in particular physicalism. And there's a part of my mind that is attracted to that because I am a physicist. I've always told people that half of my brain one of my eyes is materialist. I see the world in those terms. But the other half of my mind, or the other eye, rejects that and sees that it doesn't work. And I think materialism is almost demonstrably, physicalism is almost demonstrably false. And because it is false, I think there are realities that are not reducible to matter in physics. I think mind is one of those, so, at least rational minds are something that cannot be reduced to that level. So in my ontology, that's why I asked you at the beginning, in my ontology, there's not just the physical, there's also the rational, the intellect, the intellectual. And since I have that belief that there is such a thing, there are certain minds that are not reducible just to matter, it makes it easier for me to believe in God, you see. It's for somebody who thinks everything is just matter, then it's very hard to believe in God, because God is something beyond matter. So that's a big leap. That's a huge leap. But for somebody who's already convinced on other non-religious grounds, is already convinced that mind, that there is such a thing as mind, which in some way is more fundamental than matter, it's not such a big leap. So I want to mention that. It's a background assumption I have, or belief I have, that makes theism a lot easier for me to arrive at than it might be for somebody like you who's a materialist.
Sure, yeah, that's definitely a lot of interesting points. I definitely have an opinion on. So, for example, I would agree with you that the existence of a world needs some kind of ground of being, a necessary cause, if you will. I totally agree with that. I usually just think the necessary cause is an unknown natural thing. I think it's just some law of nature, some quantum particle, some field that we haven't discovered yet. And I think that is the necessary foundation of reality. But I totally agree that there must be some foundation to whatever the universe is, like at the Big Bang, definitely. I don't think that's I think time and space are emergent from some more fundamental natural thing, and so I definitely think that our time and space had a beginning at the Big Bang, as far as we can tell. The world is orderly one. That one I have a little harder time accepting, because I think that if the world is orderly and the fact that the world is orderly needs to be explained by a god of some kind, well, then is the god orderly? Because if the god is orderly, then wouldn't its orderliness need to be explained by a greater god that made him orderly? So, because for example, if we take the laws of nature, the typical fine-tuning argument, there's only a very small amount of them that could result in a life-permitting universe. Well, there's only a very small amount of gods that would actually create a life-permitting universe. So just as you would need a god to create a universe of this very small in this very small spectrum that would create life, you would need a greater god to create a particular god that would create this kind of universe. So why would that argument not apply to the god itself as well as the universe?
Okay. First of all, I don't believe in a god. I believe in God. And maybe we should drop the indefinite article, because I think that, I mean, maybe we could just, I'm just going to say God. I don't believe in a God. I believe in God. I believe, but you raised a couple of points, and I don't know which one I want to go, which path I want to go down, because they're both very interesting. But let's take the argument that God, if first, I'm not talking about complexity. That's the ID movement. You know, we need to explain the complexity of the world, and then I'm talking about the fact the world's an orderly place. But you say, wouldn't God have to be orderly? And the answer is no. And I think this may be a place where you're sort of thinking you're just starting off on the wrong foot entirely. And I'm not criticizing, but I think this is a fundamental difference in how we're looking at things. I think there's a natural tendency to look at God, or to imagine a God, if you want, as an object of some sort, a physical object. Because, you know, we evolved to be most comfortable and most adept at thinking about the physical world around us. I mean, that's what we had to deal with in surviving, is stuff we can see and manipulate and so on. And so our minds naturally tend to think in materialist terms to a large extent, and we can't think of an entity except as some sort of physical entity. And so you think of God as an entity, you know, and maybe in some primitive anthropomorphic religions, God is thought of as sort of having arms and legs, or though that could also just be symbolism. But that's not the God in which classical theists believe. Is not an entity with parts, a mechanism, a physical creation's not a physical process, and so forth. Now, to a classical theist, including a Catholic such as myself, we can't grasp the nature of God because he infinitely transcends our minds. We can't even understand ourselves. There are aspects of reality which I don't think we're very adept at thinking about, which is why philosophers have been arguing about the same issues for thousands of years. Mind, intellect, for example, is a different sort of a thing than a physical object. And it has a certain different, if you will, laws to it, or some characteristics. So,
just to clarify, what do you mean by orderly? Because when I think,
well, let me just get down to why God is simple according to classical theism. Doesn't have parts. He's simple. He's not ordered. He's not complex. He's perfectly simple. Now, I think the best analogy to God is not as a thing, but as an act of mind, as an act of understanding. In fact, St. Thomas Aquinas, in this much older tradition, God is an act of God is his act of understanding. God is an infinite act of understanding. Now think of what happens when you're understanding something. When you're understanding things, you understand a multiplicity of things and how they're related to each other. You're grasping all those things in a single act of insight. Suddenly, all these things, I get it. I get the point. You have an insight. You see how they're all related. And there's something simple and indivisible about that insight, that act of understanding. You can't chop that act of understanding into two parts and say, here's half of the act of understanding, here's the other half. Unless they're together as a single act of understanding, they can't understand something. Just like you can't chop a sentence into two pieces, then you don't have a sentence anymore. You have a sentence fragment. The meaning of the sentence is only there if you have the entire sentence. And an act of understanding is in some sense indivisible and simple. And this is something that I don't think we can thoroughly explore. But if we're thinking about a physical entity, you would say the more powerful the entity, if it's a machine, well, it has to be bigger and have more parts and be more complex and intricate. But an act of understanding is powerful, not in the same way. A more comprehensive act of understanding can gather several subsidiary acts of understanding and join them together into one overarching act of understanding, which is still in itself something simple. And that's why I think people are not thinking about, when you're talking about a God, there may be gods, small g gods, that people conceive of that would have to be complex and therefore need themselves or be ordered and need some cause of order. But that's not the God in which I believe. And therefore, the infinite regress that you want to set up isn't going to work. Yes, if you need, this is the trouble with the ID movement. You have complexity, so you need something. Give her a designer the designer would have to be more complex than the thing he's designing. But then somebody had to design him, and something had to design him, and you have an infinite regress, and that's no good. But I don't think that gets off the ground because the God in which Christians believe, or at least theists and Catholics believe, is perfectly simple. He's not ordered. He has no parts.
So my understanding of order is essentially it follows like it's not logically incoherent, doesn't have contradictions, not just random gibberish. It's kind of like has a coherence to it. That's what I seem to understand by the term ordered. So
right. Like to take the laws of physics, the fact that, of course, people didn't know about those 2,000 years ago, but the fact that we don't have to define order. It's a primitive term in a sense. If you don't know what order means, anything you might define it in terms of would be even more obscure. I think it's like, if you don't know what order means, there's no point in trying to define it. We can see that the world's an orderly place. But I would even focus on the incredible order that's expressible mathematically. Let's focus on that. Let's focus on the order that we see in the laws of physics. Let's focus on the mathematical structure of the laws of physics. I don't know if you're a physicist. I don't know. What's your background? Are you in physics?
Philosophy. That's my background.
I mean, you can't know physics in a deep way. I'm not talking about inclined planes and knowing Newton's laws and maybe a little stuff you may have picked up as an undergrad. But if you look at the mathematics of Einstein's theory of gravity or quantum mechanics, or even Maxwell's equations of electromagnetism, there's a lot of sophisticated mathematics there. These are very deep ideas. You have hundreds take superstring theory, which is very likely the ultimate laws of physics. The mathematics of superstring theory is so deep and rich that you've had, since at least 1984, you've had hundreds, if not thousands, of the most brilliant minds in the world trying to understand it, and they still haven't completely, some of them think they've only scratched the surface of understanding this incredible mathematical structure. Why? How does that happen? That just somehow happens of its own accord? I mean, I just can't believe that. There's a mind at work here. There's clearly, I see a mind at work that conceived of those laws.
Well, I definitely have my own opinions about superstring theory and M theory and Ed Witten.
Whatever the theory is, it's very rich.
But if we see orderliness as essentially just not randomness, I don't really think the universe could have just been inherently random. I think it must have had some order. I think anything that exists has to have some kind of order or pattern to it.
So it could have been trivial. The universe could have The universe could have been 1 degree of freedom, which oscillated endlessly, just like a pendulum. It could have been some very trivial order. It could have been
Oh, right, absolutely. And so,
tic-tac-toe. I mean, tic-tac. It could have been a game of chess.
well,
Where
that's my comparison here is I
it
think
could have been
that's
anything.
I
It
think that
wasn't
I
very
think
deep.
I think that the God could also have had trivial order. It could have just been a nothingness, like a quantum particle that created these kinds of universes you just described. And so when you think of God in the way that you do, as having the Thomistic kinds of properties of perfect knowledge, perfect love, perfect everything of, I forget exactly all the different Thomistic properties. That
No,
seems to be
I'm only partially Thomistic.
okay. So, well, all the perfections seem to be rather arbitrary. Like you could just pick a different perfection and say, well, the real perfection is that of the spaghetti monster because spaghetti is a perfection or whatever.
I haven't raised the question. I just said I think a mind must be behind the incredible richness and depth of the world is based on ideas. It's based on ideas, and I just don't see how you get ideas of such. Let's get away from just the. I'm going to switch away from just the fact that we're orderly, which I think is compelling to me, and focus in on the depth of that order, because I just can't see how. I could sort of maybe imagine that something spontaneously popped into existence or existed, which was sort of completely so trivial that it was sort of not much of a feat for it to happen by itself. Actually, I can't believe that, but at least it wouldn't be as hard to believe as it's something which is based on extremely deep ideas happened of itself. I mean, that I think you're blinking or brushing aside. Well, there must be some kind of order. But what about this fantastic order? I mean, it's not just religious people who see this. Atheist scientists have talked about how incredible the order at the level of the fundamental laws is, and how impressive it is, and strange, and wonderful.
Why would we think this comes from a mind? Because I think the order is a determined thing of some more fundamental law. Why would this induce why would we use abduction to conclude this is a mind rather than just an unknown natural force?
Well, usually ideas come from minds in our experience. I mean, a rock doesn't have ideas. A rock doesn't come up with sophisticated mathematical concepts. Human minds do.
Sure,
I mean, if I
sure.
see a brilliant game of chess, if I see
Well, I totally agree with you that rocks don't come up with ideas. Absolute nothing is what rocks dream of, as the quote goes. But I don't think that the laws of physics are an idea. I think they are a physical relationship between actually existing things. I think that we create laws to describe the things, but the laws don't actually exist anywhere. They're just human conventions to describe the things that actually exist. So I think that
well, I mean, they're formulated in a, you know, obviously, if I write down an equation, I or somebody else formulated that equation. But the laws of physics are relationships, but they're mathematical relationships. And the laws in which the mathematical equations and so forth, and rules in which we formulate them they may be, of course, the formulate when we do formulate them, but they're not arbitrary. That is, on a distant galaxy, any rational creature that was understanding electromagnetism would at some point formulate exactly the same laws of Maxwell's equations, and they would formulate the same principles of quantum mechanics and the same postulates and so on. We discover these. Yes, we formulate them, but we're discovering these. We're not inventing them. And the point is, yes, they're expressing relationships, but the relationships they're expressing are only expressible in mathematics. They are mathematical relationships at their core. This gets to a whole question of what is mathematics, which is a whole branch of philosophy. But I don't want to say, well, there's just some relationships that exist only in the things themselves. Yes, they do, but they can also be grasped by a mind, and they could be the product of a mind. And I mean,
I don't see how they
you could say that it's a different kind of order, but you could look at the words of a novel and say, well, there's a structure to these letters and so on, but that's just a relationship among these letters printed in the book. That's just a relationship among this physical stuff, these ink stains on this page made of cellulose, and that's what the order in the book is. Yes, but that order was conceived. That order can only really be understood in terms of concepts, and the order originated in that case in the mind of an author. And so, yes, as printed in the book, they're just physical relationships. But those relationships are graspable by a mind and came from a mind.
Well, I don't see the connection between the fact that it's graspable by a mind, therefore it came from a mind. For example, we can grasp the concept of tornadoes, but that doesn't mean tornadoes are created by a god like Zeus or anything. So I think that I don't see the connection you're making
No,
between.
but tornadoes are a consequence of the mathematical order of this world, the laws of physics and so forth. They are solutions to an equation, if you will. And I do believe that mathematical order is the product of a mind.
So I think math is purely descriptive, like humans made it up as a language to just describe the things we experience. For example, I exist, I cogito, and I see a TV, there is one thing, and I see a camera, there is two things, and then I can use this to build up a concrete, complex version of mathematics that I can use to describe everything around me, like F equals ma. I can say things fall, Newtonian gravity. All of that comes from just describing the things we experience, but I don't see any actual math that exists outside of our imagination. It just seems to be a language like English, like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. First sentence of classical logic is a formal language that constructs of a syntax and some kind of semantics.
Right, but not all logics are actually useful for anything. That is, if the law of non-contradiction, or there are
Excluded
the
middle.
law of logic have a certain binding quality. That is, they're not just arbitrary. If you don't think logically, you're not thinking correctly. They're not just human conventions. If somebody comes along and says, I don't agree with the law of non-contradiction, or I don't agree with the law of excluded middle, or something like that, and I prefer to use other rules of logic. And well, okay, more power to them. But the fact is they're thinking wrong. And they can choose to use different rules of logic, but they're not the right rules for thinking properly. I mean, mathematics, I guess we're not going to get very far in this. I think there's a perspective. You had to be there in some. You have to be there. It's not like some jokes you had to be there to see that they're funny. I think if you don't really have a deep grasp of the laws of physics and see them for yourselves, then I think it's easier to sort of dismiss them as just some human constructs and so on, or conveniences, conventions, or things that are convenient for describing.
Well, yeah, there's the quote from Einstein that specifically comes to mind is that so far as math is certain, it does not refer to reality, and so far as it refers to reality, it is not certain. And then there's the quote.
There's also a famous quote from Bertrand Russell: is that mathematics is the field in which we don't know what we're talking about or whether what we're saying is true. Now, all of these actually are witticisms that express something deep, but let's not get into that. I think there's just a basic divergence here. I'm telling you why I believe in God. I do not see the laws of physics that way, and nor do I think most fundamental physicists, whether atheists or religious, see them the way you do. And so most of my colleagues are not religious, though a lot of them are. But I would say that most of the people in fundamental physics, and I'm in a rather fundamental branch of physics, most of the people in fundamental physics who are dealing with the deepest laws of nature see them in a different way, I think, than you're seeing them. And they are impressed by them, and they find them remarkable. And they do inspire wonder, and they don't. It doesn't lead them to believe in God. But for somebody who's already disposed to believe in God for other reasons, I think it strengthens considerably my belief in God, because I frankly do not find it credible that these things didn't originate with the mind, that they're just some sort of spontaneous, why is the world orderly? Why does it have this rich mathematical structure? Hey, that's just the way it is. That doesn't satisfy me.
Well, could you tell me a little bit more about when you said you don't think most physicists see math the way I do? Because the way I see it is like, for example, there are sentences in English that correspond to reality, like there is a tree, and there's sentences that don't correspond to reality, like there is a unicorn, and then there are sentences that are self-contradictory, like I am a married bachelor. And math has all the same features of sentences, like 1 + 1 = 2 corresponds to reality. F = ma times 47 does not correspond to reality. And 1 + 1 = 7 is self-contradictory. So it seems like the sentences in math also are like sentences in English. Some work and some don't. And we just happen to use the ones that work because they work, rather than like the F = ma times 47.
You have to distinguish pure mathematics from the laws of physics. So what I did for a living when I was still doing this is I invent all theoretical physicists, certainly the ones in my field. What we do for a living is we come up with mathematical equations, which could describe a possible universe, because they have to be self-consistent. And we're hoping that they actually describe this universe correctly, in which case, we get our trip to Stockholm and win the Nobel Prize, or whatever. But in the 99.999% of the cases, the theories we come up with, the equations we come up with, turn out not to describe this world. And so, yes, equations can either describe the world in which we live, or they may not, or they may describe some other universe in which we don't live. But that's right. I'm just saying, I'm not mathematics. Most mathematics doesn't describe anything about the physical world. A small set of it does. I'm talking about how impressive the mathematics required to describe our universe is. To me, it's sufficiently impressive that it calls out for an explanation of why a universe of this intricacy and subtlety and based on, as I said, based on deep mathematical ideas, why that is. I cannot take seriously, it's a kind of funny thing. A lot of non-religious people who look down on religion, one of the things they say is that religious people are taught not to ask questions. We just blindly adhere to what we're taught. Now, there's such a thing as faith, and there's divine revelation, and yes, there are things we believe because we believe God revealed them. That's not mean we don't ask questions. And in fact, one of the things I think is that atheists, now I'm not saying about you, because you ask a lot of questions, and that's one reason I agreed to be on your show, is you think a lot. But I think atheism deep down is based on taking certain things for granted, in the quite literal sense. You take them for granted, and you say either, and there's no reason for them. They just are that way as a brute fact. Don't ask me why, because there really isn't. It's just the way it is. One of these is the fact that there is a real world at all. And the other is the fact that the world is orderly and has, in fact, a very sophisticated order. And I think the atheist really, I have not heard any atheist give me an explanation of that makes any sense. I think ultimately there are two logically consistent answers to why the world exists and why it is orderly. One answer is that there's a God, or the God. The other is that's the way it is. And those are both perfectly consistent. I happen to find the first answer more satisfying.
Well, wouldn't you have to answer the same question about the God? Why is there a God?
God, I believe to be a necessary being.
Well,
and I'll tell you why. And let me explain what I mean.
I apologize just to interrupt for a second there, but couldn't the naturalist just say, well, the universe is just a necessary being? There is some necessary being of nature.
But it's clearly not, because I look at the world around me and it's clearly could have been otherwise. Instead of there being this rug on the floor, there might not have been a rug. Instead of you existing, maybe the whole world would be the same, except you didn't exist. There's not the tree in my front there. The world is clearly not necessary. Also, there's nothing impossible about there not being a world at all. That's the most fundamental thing.
Right. But as a naturalist,
I tell you why I think God is the necessary being. Now, this is the way I think of God. One way, all of our ideas about God are inadequate because God transcends our capacity to understand. So we can only think about God using analogies from things we do understand a little bit. And so these analogies are all limp, as they say. They're all very inadequate. But one of the best ways of thinking about God is by analogy to a mind. Now, and this is a little hard to get across, and I'm not going to say it adequately, but I'm going to try. I'm going to make an analogy to what happens when you're a scientist or any other person trying to understand something. So the scientist is faced with some puzzling thing. He says, this phenomenon doesn't seem to make any sense. Maybe it's superconductivity. You know, how can electricity flow through this metal without any electrical resistance? That just boggles the mind. It doesn't. So he said, there's got to be an explanation. This got to make sense. It doesn't seem to make sense. And so it might struggle for years trying to make sense of this thing. Why? Why is he so convinced that it makes sense? Maybe it doesn't make any sense. No, but he and I and most scientists are convinced that the world makes sense. And in particular, this thing must make sense. What does it mean to say that it makes sense? What is he after? He's after an act of understanding that he wants to happen in his own mind, a flash of insight. Let's call it an act of understanding. Through that act of understanding, he will grasp how this makes sense. Okay? To say that it makes sense means there exists some act of understanding that if you have that act of understanding, then you have made sense of it. You've understood the thing. Now, you may never get that act of understanding. Maybe somebody smarter than you has it, or maybe no human being will ever have it, but some scientist on another galaxy will have it. But there's an act of understanding, and I want to have that. Okay? And the scientist is convinced that such an act of understanding exists in some platonic sense, exists, and he wants to get to it, achieve it. Now, if you think that a particular phenomenon or some particular thing makes sense, must make sense, you're convinced of that in advance. In advance. You can't show that it makes sense. If you could show that it made sense, you wouldn't have to try to make sense of it. You're convinced in advance that there is such an act of understanding that will make sense of it. I am convinced in advance, and this lies at the root of theism. I am convinced in advance that all of reality, all things make sense.
Including God?
Yes.
So, but I thought
so there exists now such an act of understanding that would grasp all of the reality, make sense of all things. It must be an infinite act of understanding. It also has to be unified, because in a different sort of aspects of that act of understanding there has to be one act of understanding that comprehends, holds together in one act of understanding all things.
Well, I'm not sure.
And that is God. And that's why talking about a God is silly, because that is the God in which theists believe, because it can't be added to, because then it wouldn't be the total, complete act of understanding if it could be added to. Nor can it be subtracted from, because then it would no longer be the perfect, complete, total act of understanding. There's only one such act, and it's unique. It can't be added to or subtracted from it. And it can't be different unless there were two different acts of understanding that were not related to each other, that understood all things. So that is God. Now, I believe, because I think the world is intelligible, that act of understanding, it exists in some sense. Just as I believe that if this physical phenomenon makes sense, there exists an act of understanding that would grasp it. If all of reality makes sense, there exists an act of understanding that would grasp it all. It has to exist. I can never have that if I had that infinite and total act of understanding myself. I would be God. Because that is God, that act of understanding. And yes, it understands itself. God understands himself. The infinite and complete act of understanding grasps itself, and nothing else can grasp it. And so, yes, God knows and understands himself. And I believe that's why I can't get really across. I'm trying to express the inexpressible in a way.
Well, right. That's what I wanted to actually ask about.
Necessary being. It's necessary if the world makes sense, if reality makes sense. That act of understanding has to exist in some sense.
Well, there seems to be a contradiction there, because you keep saying that you're trying to express the inexpressible, and that God isn't something that we can really understand. We can only make some kind of an analogy to him. So it seems like he would not be comprehensible in the same way that you described.
We cannot fully comprehend.
Right. So, but I would say that if I would agree that the fundamental nature of the universe is comprehensible, and so that would kind of exclude God.
I'm not just limited to the universe. I would not just the physical universe. What is a mind? What is consciousness? By the way, we can get to that subject if there's time. Consciousness certainly is a phenomenon. It's not a part of the physical. It's not physical in sense of physics. Or what is reason? What is free will? There are a lot of realities. So that's something we don't understand. And physics will not tell us what those are. I would also include mathematical reality. I would include all of reality. I'm not limiting it to the physical, the
Right.
physical.
So by universe, I meant everything, all things.
All of reality, including God himself.
But so yeah, by universe, I just meant all things. So I would include those in the definition. But
Now, God, I would radically, of course, distinguish the theist, the creator and the created are radically and infinitely incommensurable with each other. You don't want to lump them together.
right. So earlier you said the universe could have been otherwise, and the way I see it, well, God could have been otherwise too. I
I
don't
just
think.
explain why, because if what I think necessarily exists is an infinite, perfect, complete act of understanding that grasps all things that are intelligible. Now, how can that be otherwise? Because there's a correct way of understanding something, and then there are other ways of understanding that are not really correct and not really an understanding of those things. If there's an act of understanding that grasps all reality, it has to be unique if it's the correct understanding of all of reality. And it can't be added to or made, it can't be altered by subtraction. If you took away something, it would no longer be the total and complete act of understanding. Nor can you add anything because it's already the complete act of understanding. That's what I'm saying. It can't be otherwise, and I don't think it cannot exist. Because if I deny that such an act is possible, exists, I'm denying ultimately, I believe, the intelligibility of reality.
Well, I see a problem there.
If something's liftable, if something is liftable, it means there is something conceivable that can lift it. If something is understandable, then there is an act of understanding that can understand it. If there is no such act of understanding that could understand something, then it is not understandable.
Yeah, but that doesn't follow there is actually something doing the understanding. Like it's clearly logically possible.
I don't think that God there's God and then there's his understanding, because in traditional theism, you want to say St. Thomas would agree with this, but not just he. God is his act of understanding. There's not a super brain out there that's God's brain, and then that's doing the understanding. God is the act of understanding.
So I see an issue with the idea that God is could not have been otherwise, but is this pure act of understanding, because this
pure and unrestricted, or pure, complete, total, perfect act of understanding.
So just to take like specific examples, the creation of Jesus, or what particularly your view on, I don't know what your view on the history of the world is, but there was a very specific way in which it was created, and that seems to be quite could have been otherwise, very, very much so. And saying that that was determined by some God who has a perfect nature that couldn't have been otherwise seems quite arbitrary. Like obviously God could have not done those things or done different things.
Of course. And here's again, I think where I think you're misled. Some of the email you sent me. God is himself a necessary being, could not have been otherwise. Now, I think you want to take the next step, another step, and say, but God's nature, which could not be otherwise by hypothesis, my hypothesis, other people's, must determine what he creates. And therefore, what he creates is sort of has to be necessary and couldn't be otherwise. But of course, now you may say that this is inconsistent, and this is very interesting point, but that's actually not what a Catholic or a traditional theist would say, because what we would say is that God's nature is necessary. God is a necessary being, but he doesn't create out of necessity. It does not follow from his nature that he has to create anything or that he has to create any particular thing. He creates freely. That's actually a dogma of the Catholic faith. He creates freely. In other words, what that means is not by a necessity of his nature. And so it's not that this is in some Leibnizian sense the best of all possible worlds. God is good. God is perfectly good. Therefore, he is obligated to create, and I don't know if Leibniz thought he was obligated to create, but he must create the best of all possible worlds. And therefore, he had to create this specific world with me sitting here talking to you, and my name has to be Stephen Barr, and I have to have these. No, that's not the traditional view. There is no such thing as the best of all possible worlds in the first place. So it's not only is God not obligated to create the best of all possible worlds, that's a meaningless concept. God is not obligated to create anything. And I think this is the trouble. If you think of a physical mechanism, a physical entity, its behavior sort of flows inevitably from its nature. Or to the extent that, or there could be some randomness, as pure randomness is in quantum mechanics involved. So the effects that flow from a physical thing, if you know the nature of the physical thing completely, you can predict, at least probabilistically, what it's going to do. That's not the same when you're talking about minds necessarily, rational minds. The analogy, I think, is not, again, to a physical process, which unfolds in some way that's quasi-inevitable from its nature. Think more of an artist. Think of Mozart. Yes, Mozart had a certain nature, and that explains why he was able to write beautiful symphonies and so forth. But Mozart was not obligated to write any particular symphony. It didn't follow from his nature that he had to write a particular symphony. He could have written other symphonies. Maybe if he lived longer, he would have certainly have written other symphonies. And he might have chosen not to write. Schubert might not have written his Fifth Symphony. He might have written a different symphony than the one he actually wrote.
So doesn't that mean he could have been otherwise?
I love my wife. I might do something nice for her, because love is to will the good of the other person. So I might do something nice. I might buy her a present. I might do something with her. I might clean the house. I didn't have to do that. It did follow from my nature in the sense that I am a being who's capable of love, and so on. But it doesn't uniquely follow that that what I do is uniquely follows from my nature, because that's exactly what makes us free. That's the very definition of traditional notion of free will, that I make choice, that I have acts of will that do not uniquely follow either from external circumstances or from my own state before I made the choice. And so the element of freedom comes in here, which is a mystery, quite frankly.
So, but if that's a mystery, that seems like he could have been otherwise, because he could have chosen X or could have chosen Y.
Yes, God could have chosen to create a different world or no world.
So there are different. God could have been otherwise.
No, because the traditional understanding is that God is not changed. The universe depends for its existence upon God as its cause of existence. But God is not in any sense affected by the universe. God is one and the same whether he created the universe or not. So as a traditional understanding of St. Thomas is the relationship between God and the universe is only real on the side of the universe. The universe depends upon God, but God himself is unaffected at all by the fact that the universe exists. God's nature is not at all affected by that.
Right, but here's where I see the issue, because it seems like that's like a scapegoat that the Thomists kinds of use to say, well, the universe could have been otherwise, therefore the universe is not the necessary being, but God couldn't have been otherwise because he's got this free will thing, and the free will thing could have been differently, but not God.
God cannot be otherwise.
Oh, no, I understand that. So I'm saying that the idea of free will is a way for him to make a spectrum of possibilities that he could choose from, but he is not. He could still be the same necessary being unchanged with this spectrum of possibilities. And it seems like we could just use the same kind of ad hoc reasoning to say, well, the universe has a spectrum of possibilities as a result from a quantum particle or whatever, and the quantum particle is unaffected and unchanged anyway.
Right. Let's get to quantum mechanics and whether you could have a natural creator of the universe, which could be a quantum. Look, I actually happen to think that the idea that the universe arose through a quantum fluctuation is a very beautiful idea. And if I had to bet, I would think that it was true. I like this idea very much. It was first proposed, as far as I know, back in 1982 by Alex Valenkin. And I remember back in 1982 reading his paper and thinking how beautiful it was. And it's very compelling. I like this idea a lot. I think you're misunderstanding what creation means, or at least some people out in your audience might misunderstand. Can I make an analogy? First, I'm going to quote Hawking. Hawking, towards the end of his life, wrote a book with a guy named Mlodinow, in which he proposed that the laws of quantum gravity could create the universe through a quantum fluctuation. So you don't need God to create the universe, because the laws of physics can create the universe through a quantum fluctuation. Well, the answer to that was actually given very well by Hawking himself in 1988 in his first famous popular book, A Brief History of Time, where he asked, and I think he was thinking much more clearly at that point, he asked the right question. What he said was, and I'm almost verbatim, this is from memory, but I think it's almost verbatim, all that physics gives you is a set of rules and equations. Well, any model, he said model, but let's say theory, I think it's a better word. Any theory of physics gives you is a set of rules, mathematical rules and equations. What, he said, breathes fire into those equations, and that's poetic, so that there is an actual world, a real world for those, an actually existing world for those equations to describe. He said physics cannot explain. He said cannot explain, and I think was completely right back then. Physics cannot explain why there is the equations themselves cannot explain why there is an actual world for the equations to describe. That's what creation is. Now, let me use a different analogy to expand on that. I'm a chess player by avocation, and now consider a game. Chess is like a little miniature universe. It has its own space of 8 by 8 and has matter, the pieces, and has laws, which are the rules, and has time, which is so it's a little mini universe. I could have the rules of some game in hand that are the complete rules of that game. They, in the same way the laws of physics are the rules of this universe. The rules of the game tell you what kinds of things happen in the game, under what circumstances they happen, in what order they happen. It tells you that the game of chess begins, and it begins in a certain way. It tells you that the game of chess must end, and it has to end in a certain way, certain ways. But what the laws of chess do not tell you, cannot tell you, is whether there's an actual game of chess that has ever been played, is now being played, or ever will be played. The laws could be described, the rules of chess could be describing completely fictitious or hypothetical or possible games. It cannot make real the events they're describing. In the same way, the laws of physics are just a set of rules. And as I say, every week or two, I come up with a set of rules that I hope are the rules of this universe. There are also infinite number of possible rules of possible universes. The question is, why are the laws of physics, these rules, why is there an actual universe, an existing universe, not a hypothetical or possible or conceivable one, but a real one that is described by it? That's what creation is. So the laws of physics cannot create. They're describing a possible universe. Creation is the giving of reality, the making of that thing real. Now, you can say nothing makes it real. It just not by God. It just, that's the way it is. There's a real universe. Like it or lump it, Don't ask me why. There's a real universe. It's a fact. Yes, it's a fact. Don't ask me why. It's just the way it is. Or you can say there must be a cause of there being a real universe. And that one possibility is God. And you may say, well, that makes no sense to you. But those are the choices on offer. What makes no sense, and both of those are consistent. You can say there's no cause of the being, that the universe is real. Or you can say there's a cause, and I define that to be God. Don't tell me it's the laws of physics. That makes no sense at all.
Absolutely. The laws of physics are descriptive languages that we've made up to describe reality. So
gravity can't. Don't tell me it's a quantum fluctuation created the universe. A quantum fluctuation didn't create the universe. Creation is not a set of events at the temporal beginning of the universe.
Right. I don't think there is ever a time where there is a nothing. There was never a philosophical nothing. So there is always something there.
Use an analogy. There's the beginning of a symphony is the first notes in its internal sequence, an internal sequence of notes. The beginning of the symphony are the first notes in the sequence. The origin of the symphony, the reason there's a symphony at all, is the composer's mind conceived of it.
Right, but I think there's a third option there you didn't include.
The Big Bang or quantum fluctuation. Quantum fluctuation that may have happened at the beginning of the universe is it's a set of physical events in the universe. It's part of the universe. It's not the cause of the universe. It's a part of it's the events with which the universe had its temporal beginning.
Right. I agree with you. I don't think that everything had a beginning. I think there is a necessary thing, and I don't think that necessary thing is a mind at all. I think it's just some kind of thing in physics that was a necessary thing.
That would be part of the physical universe. What is? You say, well, that thing could be a physical entity. Well, then you're saying this physical entity, which is a part of the physical universe, is the reason there is a physical universe at all?
No, No,
something in a novel and saying this thing in the novel is the explanation of why there's a novel.
right. No. I think there is a necessary foundation to reality, and that part of reality is the thing that always existed throughout all reality. So I
We'll
think
call that
it's
God then.
well, it doesn't have a mind. There's no mind to it.
Okay, then we're debating the nature of God. You see, it's sort of like in mathematics. Mathematicians are often able to prove, and this is, that certain equation has a solution. Existence proofs. They can prove this equation has a solution. They don't know what it is, but they can prove that it has one. And you can prove that an nth order polynomial equation has n solutions to it. Doesn't mean you know what they are, but sometimes you can prove. I think that I am convinced there are the compelling arguments that there's an ultimate cause of being, if you want a ground of being, a reason that the universe is orderly, and so on. That doesn't necessarily mean I understand everything about that entity. Now, you could try to convince me that entity or whatever it is, I would call that God. St. Thomas always argued that. He said, there has to be this, this, and this, and that is what we call God. Now, then we can argue about the nature of that entity. Is it have a mind? Well, in a sense, no, not as we do. I would agree with you. God does not have a mind in the sense that we do. God's mind, for example, is God is unchanging. He doesn't have a succession of thoughts the way we do. I would say God is above whatever he is. He is greater than minds as we understand minds. I'm just saying he's not less than. He's not an unconscious thing. Whatever his consciousness is, it's something like our consciousness, analogous to it, but of course infinitely transcending it. If he has a mind, our mind is the closest thing in the world that we know, is most like God. But God infinitely is beyond our mind. His mind as far exceeds ours as my mind exceeds the mind of my dog Sparky, or a mind of an ant, if an ant has a mind. Now, I agree with you. We don't want to anthropomorphize God and think that he has a mind like ours, but he has something that our minds are sort of reflecting, are pale reflections of, and his mind is infinitely transcends ours. And so, but we can argue about that. And we could argue whether God loves, in what sense he loves. We could argue whether God is good.
Yeah, I think
if you believe in God, you just have a different conception of God than I do. You believe there's a necessary being who's the origin of things.
I think most physicists would agree that there is always some necessary foundation to reality. That I think many of them would agree it's not a God. They go the other direction where minds are an emergent
God
property.
like Zeus. Admitted, I also reject all gods except God.
All right, but I think most physicists,
other gods.
most physicists think there is a natural foundation to the universe, and so it's never not existed. There was never a philosophical nothing in most physics models. They usually just have a past eternal infinite of some kind.
No. Not a past eternal. No, that's not true. Probably the most likely thing. It's not provable, but the weight of evidence is strong. Time runs out. Time has a finite extent into the past, probably. And then it makes no sense. So it could be at the Big Bang. It could be at some earlier time. Let's suppose, just for discussion, it's at the Big Bang. Let's suppose the Big Bang was the beginning of the universe, and it was about 13.8 billion years ago. Then it makes no sense to talk, if that is true, if the Big Bang was the beginning of the universe, then it makes no sense to talk about 30 billion years ago. There's no such thing. There's not a past infinite extent of time. Time ends.
What do you mean by that?
That's irrelevant to creation.
Apologies to interrupt you there.
That's irrelevant to the idea of creation. Whether the universe is past infinite in extent, has an infinite past or a finite past.
So what I mean by infinite here is like Sean Carroll in his debate with William Lane Craig just Googled it and said, here's 30 models of physics that all have a past infinite, like the multiverse, the string theory, many worlds.
Okay. Now, he is a cosmologist, but of course I'm a particle theorist and I do cosmology too, and I know a lot about it. A lot of my papers are in cosmology, Big Bang cosmology. The current state of the question there is there are a couple of very strong reasons to suspect that the universe has to have a beginning. One is the second law of thermodynamics, and the other, which I think is the more powerful reason, And the other is a theorem of Borda-Guth and Vilenkin, which doesn't prove the universe had a beginning, but it says that if you have a universe that's on the whole expanding, that roughly speaking, you have an expanding universe at all, that if you trace the world line of any particle and back far enough, you either hit a beginning of time or you hit a place where the very notion of time breaks down. And so there are very strong reasons to suspect. Now, yes, take eternal inflation. There are most cosmologists, and I've talked to Alan Guth and about this. Most cosmologists are of the view that eternal inflation, which it might well be true, is eternal into the future, but cannot be eternal into the past. The inventor of eternal inflation, Andre Linde, disagrees, but most cosmologists agree. The Borda-Guth-Vilenkin theorem applies to eternal inflation. There's other scenarios like the ekpyrotic universe, in which you have an endless cycle of two parallel universes crashing into each other and moving apart. And as conceived of by Paul Steinhardt, I think he likes to believe that that's been going on forever and will go on forever in the future. But again, the Borda-Guth-Vilenkin theorem applies to that scenario too, and suggests there had to be a beginning in time. And so there are very strong, yes, there are models out there. You don't have to tell me that. In particle theory and cosmology, there's a lot. At any given time, there are thousands of models out there. But there are strong reasons, arguments disfavoring models that have past infinite extent. But that's irrelevant to the question of creation anyhow. That's utterly irrelevant. That has to do with the structure of the universe. It doesn't have to do with why there's a universe. St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, admitted that there were no compelling philosophical arguments that the time had to have a beginning. He said he was aware of no compelling argument. He said it was perfectly philosophically consistent to believe that you could have an endless sequence of events with no beginning, with a man being begotten by his father, who was begotten by his father, all the way back to infinity, the way, Aristotle believed. He did believe, however, that the universe had to have an origin, a source of being. He said God could have created a universe with no beginning. He could have created a universe with a finite past. God could have done either one. But you need a God. You need a source of being. So those are completely distinct questions. I mean, we shouldn't even talk about that. Whether there's a creator, it's an irrelevant question of whether the universe has past infinite or past finite.
Right. So I'm the argument I'm making here is that most physicists think there is a ground of being to the universe. It's usually just grounded in physics, which is along that past infinite. Like I'm pretty familiar with the BGV theorem. I've talked with Guth and Vilenkin, both of them. And Guth thinks that there isn't, his theory only applies to certain kinds of inflations and geometries. It doesn't, the universe didn't have a beginning.
It only applies, there are, like any theorem, there are assumptions. And the assumptions are yes, that it has to be, but in some sense, always expanding on average. And it's mathematically more precise than that. Yes. So for example, one way of having a past infinite universe is to have what's called a de Sitter. So if a de Sitter space is past infinite, but what happens is you go back in time, it gets bigger and bigger. So if for infinite time it shrinks, reaches a minimum size, and then for infinite time expands. Mathematically quite self-consistent to have a past infinite universe. Physicists would regard that as unphysical, that having a universe that's contracting for infinite time reaches a minimum size, then expands. For technical reasons, that would be regarded as rather unphysical. Logically possible, past infinite, but would be regarded as not a satisfactory model for certain reasons.
Well, I think that's Sean Carroll's model, actually. I don't think.
Yeah, actually, so what his model, sort of a Janus. There's one version of that, which is that when you reach the minimum size, then go in either direction. You have time going this way in one direction, and time going the other way in the other direction, so that the minimum size, you have sort of very low entropy, and the arrow of time, as it's called, goes. Basically, what that amounts to, actually, is you have two universes, each of which has a beginning of time, because each path has an arrow of time, and you would then identify this as the beginning of both arrows. So it would be sort of like two universes, each which had a beginning in time, but the beginnings were sort of, they're joined like Siamese twins, so to speak. But anyway, that's not a very plausible scenario. He likes it probably because it allows him to not have. He probably thinks that the beginning of time is somehow connected with creation, which is utterly wrong. He doesn't like the idea of creation, so he probably doesn't like the idea of a beginning of time. And so he cooks up a scenario which appeals to him on those grounds, which he thinks has no beginning of time. But as I said, those are extra physics considerations. Anyway, they have nothing to do with creation.
Right, but that's where I think is the conflation here, because most physicists think, yes, there is some ground of reality. Reality never not existed, so there is some ground of being there.
Right.
But,
at all times, the universe has existed.
Right.
The time is infinite in the past or finite in the past.
So in that sense,
any time you can talk about, because time is a feature of the universe.
So based on your definition, that means they all believe in a God, and I don't think.
No. Well, I don't know what I don't think most physicists have even asked themselves whether there's some ultimate ground of existence or cause of being of the universe. To be honest with you, my experience is that most physicists don't think about such things. But I think most of them, if pressed, would say they don't think there is any ultimate cause or reason why there is a universe. They would say there just is, and that the laws of physics describe it. And that's what I think most of them would say. I haven't polled them, but that's my impression. I doubt you think and I'm actually surprised and glad to hear you say that you think there's some ultimate cause or ground of existence of the universe. I don't think that's the typical view. And that's why I say I think, believe in some kind of, in God, a God very different in character than the one I believe in, perhaps. Also, anyway, but I don't think that's necessarily what scientists believe. They just, here's a universe. It's this physical structure. It has may have a beginning in time, past infinite, or maybe not. But it is what it is, as they say. There it is. And, physics describes it. And that's
the way I usually phrase it in my conversations with physicists is I ask, is there some fundamental substance that instantiates all of the existence in physics? And they usually say, yeah, it's like energy or some kind of field.
That's not a cause. That's what the universe is made of. That's not a cause of its reality.
Well, they see it kind of like the pantheism, where God and the universe are the same. So the fact that energy grounds everything is that they're kind of a God in that sense.
Energy doesn't. Again, this is back to the point that Hawking so perceptively made. The reason there is a real universe, there can be a substance out of which the universe is made. Maybe the universe is ultimately deep down, the deepest level is quantum fields, or it could be superstrings, or it could be green cheese. That's just what it's made of. It doesn't explain that doesn't explain why there is a universe at all, rather than nothing whatsoever.
Wait a minute. If we know what the universe is made of, and how the structure of the universe is determined by what it's made of, then that would answer that question, wouldn't it?
No, not at all. Because what physics, first of all, to a contemporary physicist, what the universe is made of ultimately is mathematical structure. It's mathematical structure all the way down. If you ask, what is an electron made of? Electron is basically a mathematical structure. So is a quantum field. Once you describe the mathematical structure of an electron or of quantum field, you said everything there is to know about it, except one thing, that there are actually existing things of that sort. I'm trying to get across that physics describes the universe, including what it's made of. It doesn't explain, as Hawking correctly said when he was thinking more clearly in 1988, it doesn't explain why there's a universe. The alternative is you could have nothing whatsoever, blank non-existence, not empty space, because space is something, it has structure. Blank non-existence, no matter, no time, no space, no nothing. Nothing. The question is why there's an actual something. Now, you can tell me that here's the something and it has this structure, but that's not explaining why there is a something. Now, when you say, what is it made of? Well, to a physicist, to say what it's made of is really to say its mathematical structure. And I'll give you a very nice analogy made by the great physicist. I love this. I came across it on the chess website. Dirac, who was an avid chess player, he was one of the founders of quantum mechanics, one of the greatest scientists of the 20th century. He was giving a public lecture in India about, and he said, if you ask me what an electron is made of, now he was assuming electrons are truly fundamental particles. We now, very likely they're made of something more fundamental, which is strings. But let's, for the sake of it, whatever, he could have said strings. But let's say he's considering electrons as fundamental entities. If you say, what is an electron made of? He said, in a certain sense, that's a meaningless question. He said, now, if you ask, what is a chess piece made of, a knight made of? He said, well, it could be made of ivory, it could be made of wood, it could be made of a symbol drawn on a piece of paper. He said, that's irrelevant. Well, all that matters about a knight is how it moves. What makes a knight is how it moves, is the mathematical rule for how it moves. Really, chess is a mathematical structure. What a knight is simply a set of rules, mathematical rules. Now, we humans, to play chess, we use as mnemonic devices, physical chessboards made of wood or ivory, where we have pictures in our mind. Those are all just mathematical mnemonic devices. If you ask what is an ellipse, it's not the chalk shape on the blackboard. Ellipse is a mathematical structure. We may draw something on the blackboard to help us think about it, but that's a mnemonic device. The game of chess is just a set of rules. And a knight is nothing other than, and there's nothing more to say about it than the mathematical rules determining how it moves on the chessboard. In the same way, an electron, Dirac was saying, is just a set of, it's what we would now call the Dirac equation, basically. It's a set of mathematical structure. That's all there is to it. So the universe, once you've told me its mathematical structure, you've said all there is to say about describing it.
Well, that's definitely where I think.
But you've described it. But what makes it real? What makes it a real universe, as opposed to the one I dreamed up in my office at one point, which maybe had 5 space dimensions and different laws and different forces? Why is this a real damn universe?
Well, I think that's like asking, why is reality reality? Like, I think that's confusing the map and the territory. The electron isn't a mathematical structure. It is a thing in the universe that we describe with a mathematical structure.
A mathematically describable structure.
Sure, but the math is just a language we made up. It's not actually in the electron.
It is a structure. I'm a structuralist when it comes to mathematics.
Like a structural realist?
Realist. The universe is a structure that is mathematically describable. And that is the most, and the physical universe, I'm leaving out things like mental reality. The physical universe is a mathematical structure. It's a structure. Its structure can be expressed and described in the language of mathematics, and that is the completely adequate and complete description of it. You can also describe it in other ways, but those are more approximate or crude, commonsensical ways, but the correct, perfectly adequate description of it is mathematical description. So it's a structure that is mathematically describable, and there's nothing to the physical universe as a physical universe other than that. But there's the question of why it happens to go, as Hawking said, why does it go to all the trouble of existing at all?
Well, from my understanding, most physicists don't think it's just math. They think there's a thing there. They just use the math to describe it.
The thing there is the universe.
Right. There's like an actual physical substance that we're describing, not just math.
Yes, but this is where I think you make the same mistake that my Thomist friends make, which is this is sort of like the Aristotelian way of thinking about things. So you have a bronze ball. Well, there's a stuff, which is bronze, and then there's a mathematical form of it, which is the spherical shape. So you've got stuff, and you've got the mathematical shape of it. There's the marble, and then there's the shape of the statue. Matter, form. I'm not denying that there's a valuable distinction between matter and form. Matter in the Aristotelian. What I'm saying is, when you get to the physics, fundamental physics, way of looking at the physical universe, it's form all the way down. And this is the point Dirac was making. Don't think that there's an electron is some physical electron stuff, It's like, well, there's muon stuff and there's proton stuff. There's electron stuff. And then an electron is a little clump of that electron stuff. Maybe it has a certain structure, shape. No. If you ask what is an electron, or what are the fundamental, whatever the fundamental constituents of the physical universe are, they are just mathematical structures. The stuff doesn't play any role, any more than it matters to how a chess knight moves, whether the thing you're symbolizing it with is wood or ivory. That's nothing. It's just the rule. There's nothing to the physical universe that's not captured by the laws of physics and the mathematical rules and equations, to the physical universe in and of itself. Nothing else.
So yeah, when I've talked with like physicists, especially atheist physicists, they don't think it's just math all the way down.
Well, they're wrong.
But you can't misrepresent their position. You can't.
If I pressed them on this and forced their hand and explained what I meant by saying it's mathematical structure, I think most of them in fundamental physics would agree with me and with Dirac on this point. You may be asking the question in the wrong way and eliciting the right answer because you're asking it wrong. They would agree that and that maybe what they're saying is, well, what distinguishes the mathematical structure as a purely mathematical entity that a pure mathematician might study, and the physical universe, which is an actually existing thing. And so, in a sense, they might be making the same distinction I am.
Well, no, I specifically
mathematical structures that have a merely Platonic or existence as pure math, but there's the fact that this universe is a real thing, and that's what they may mean, is that it's a real thing. It's a real substance with that mathematical structure. But I would simply phrase that as saying that it really exists. And maybe it's simply another language of saying it really exists.
Yeah, I just specifically asked them, do you agree with structural realism that the relations is the real thing, or is there actually a substance there independent of the relations? And they say, yeah, there's a substance. There's really something there independent of just the math.
Well, structural realism is a school of pure mathematics, whether, say, triangles exist. Not whether triangular object. So we're not talking about structural realism as a point of view in the philosophy of pure math. But anyway, we may be just spinning our wheels and arguing about words. But I'm not going to answer for what other physicists believe about God, or whether they believe that there's an ultimate cause of being. To be honest with you, I don't think most of them have thought very hard about this. And I think their views it's hard to distinguish or tell whether they were agreeing with me or you, because we'd have to figure out what they meant by the words they're using and what I mean and what you mean. And that would be a very complicated exercise. But as I said, I live among these people and I talk to them, and I don't think the vast majority of them actually think about this a lot. There are some, Sean Carroll, thinks about these things, and a few others whose names we all know. But I wouldn't be in a position, I don't know anyone's in a position to say what most physicists think about these things.
Well, when I've talked to them, I usually ask this question because it's what I think
about. You don't talk to most
time.
physicists. You talk to a few well-known ones who are on record as having opinions about this kind of thing.
And the ones at the universities I go to and the ones at the groups I talk at. So, but yes, but I always usually ask them, we all think there is some fundamental nature of reality. Like there is something there, there is a there. And that seems to be what you're calling God. Just whatever the fundamental nature of reality is, that's God. And so it seems like...
Well...
It seems like based on that definition, we all think there's a God because we all think there's some fundamental nature to reality. But I don't think I don't think most people would agree with that definition of a God.
The nature of reality, use the word nature as, say, a lot of philosophers use it. The nature of the universe would be what makes the universe the way it is, not some other way. I mean, the nature of the universe, I would say the nature of the universe is completely contained. The nature of the physical universe, again, leaving aside mind, the nature of the physical universe is completely contained in the laws of physics. There's what the old argument in philosophy, sincere philosophy, essence and existence. And, does nature essence precede existence, or does essence follow existence? And many philosophers throughout history have distinguished in an entity its essence, which is another word for its nature, and its existence. And so physics describes the nature of the universe. And then there's the question of its existence. Only in God, according to traditional theism and Catholicism, and St. Thomas and so on, in God, essence and existence are one and the same. There's no distinction. But in other things, they're different because, and you can tell they're different because you take something of a given nature like our universe, or like anything. You could imagine something of that nature. You could imagine that thing didn't exist, but you can still understand the nature, right? As you could, I can understand what a frog is, and I can imagine a world in which there were no frogs. Nothing of that nature existed. You can still talk about the nature, and then there's the question of whether anything of that nature exists. And the universe, the nature of it is given by physics, the physical universe. Physics. I know of no other thing that tells me the nature of physical stuff than physics. That's the nature of the physical world. Then there is the existence of the physical world. You may disagree. I believe that something other than the physical world has to explain why the physical world exists. The physical world cannot be the cause of its having existence. It seems to me that's circular. The physical universe cannot be the cause of its having existence. So whatever the cause of its having existence must be something other than the universe. That's what I call God. You're going to say that the ultimate ground of the universe's existence is a physical substance. Well, physical substance is a part of the universe. So you're essentially saying that the universe or some part of the universe is the cause of the universe having existence. And I think that's circular.
Well, couldn't you just say God can't be the explanation of his own existence either?
He doesn't need a cause of existence because, as I said, his essence implies his existence. There's no distinction between essence and existence.
Well, that seems arbitrary to me. I can just say the universe is its own essence.
Well, it's sort of like, as I said, the analogy of mathematics. In mathematics, you can say, well, I could study this equation. I can deduce by various methods that it has a solution. And I don't know, and then I have to try to either find the solution or at least explore some of its properties without actually finding it. I might find that I might be able to prove that the solution of this equation is a real number. I might be able to prove that it's an even number or something, but I may not know it, but I may be able to find things about it. It seems to me the basic chain of argument when it comes to a cause of existence is this: anything which by nature could exist, whose nature does not imply its own existence, that it could exist or not exist. The chair I'm sitting in, it doesn't have to exist. It didn't have to. It does, but it didn't have to. There's nothing in the concept of a chair. There's nothing in the nature of this chair. It means that there had to be a thing of this nature in existence. It just happens to exist. Anything of that sort, it has contingent existence, as you know, philosophers call it, which could have existed or not have existed. The argument is it has to have a cause of its existence. But if something is a necessary, but that cause, then you can ask the question, that cause of its existence, it's either a contingent being or a necessary being. If it's a contingent being, then there must be a cause of its existence. But you don't want an infinite regress. And so you either have to say that there's no cause of existence, which I think is I think it's a defensible and logically consistent position, which is essentially, I think, atheism. Or you have to come to a cause of existence in this chain, which is itself a necessary being, and therefore does not need a cause of existence. And that is what that thing, entity, whatever you want to call it, is what I would define to be God. Then you can ask questions about God, maybe understand some aspects of God. But either there is such a solution to the question or there isn't.
Right, but there's natural...
Arbitrary. It follows from the argument that either such a thing exists, which is a necessary being, or you end up with either contingent beings do not need a cause of existence. That's fine. You can go with that. I don't agree with that. Or they do need a cause of existence, and you end up with an infinite regress of such causes, which I think is another way of saying there's no cause. Just like a mathematical proof that has no first statement is not a proof of anything. A mathematical proof has to start somewhere. You can't just say this proposition is true because this one is true, and this is true because this one is true with an infinite regress. So then you haven't proven a damn thing. Or you have to say that the cause of being that chain of causes of being has to terminate in something which doesn't need a cause of its existence because it exists by necessity, because it's its very nature to exist. And that is the theist conception of God. God, it is the nature of God to exist. God is, as it were, being.
Right, but
God
I think most people just call that reality. They just say reality is the thing that has to exist.
But that reality could consist of nothing.
Well, it can't because I exist in it, so it definitely can't.
It happens to be an empirical, we know a posteriori because we're sitting here talking, that there are things. But that's the whole point. This is what Leibniz says. Why is there something rather than nothing? It's logically impossible for there to have been nothing. Of course, I don't know whether he thought God was a necessary being. I think he did, but I don't know. But it's logically, if you're an atheist, you could say it's logically consistent to suppose, it's a logically consistent state of affairs to say that there's nothing whatsoever. And so
including the God, yes.
Yes. So I'm going to say I'm an atheist now for purposes of argument. I ask myself, why couldn't there have been just simply nothing whatsoever? And the question of, but we know as a matter of empirical fact that there is something. And so that requires an explanation. That's the cause of being that we're asking.
Right. And then you have two options. Either it was.
That's the thing. You say, well, the universe is the necessary being, but it isn't a necessary being. It can't be the ultimate cause of being because it itself doesn't have to be.
Well, again, by universe, I'm just using that as synonymous with reality. Right. So everything, universe is everything.
The chain of argument that leads to the existence of a necessary being, which is the ground of being or the cause of being of everything else, if we stipulate that is valid argumentation, I say, well, whatever that ultimate cause of being is, which is a necessary being, there's a lot about it I don't know, obviously. Except there's a lot bigger, and it's a lot more impressive than I am because it gave rise to my existence. So it's obviously, it can't be unconscious because it can't give rise to a mind if itself. It has to be something a little bit more impressive.
Wait, why is that? So I mean, every atheist I know would agree. Yes, there's reality is reality. There's some fundamental nature to reality, and we can call that the necessary thing. Happy to agree with that. None of them agree with that next statement you just made. Like we can.
What I was going to say is, it can't just be the universe. That's just going back to step one.
Well, universe is just synonymous with
existence is not necessary, which led to the whole argument.
Well, again, the universe is just everything. That's just means reality.
The universe exists. We both agree. The universe does not have to exist by any necessity.
Well, again, I apologize.
Even if you don't agree, this is the argument. It didn't have to exist, so it has a cause of being.
Right.
You end up with a necessary being. If you go back and say, but now the universe is the necessary being, well, not only wasted a lot of our time because he could have just started saying that, but it obviously is violating the very premise that we started with, which is gave rise to the question in the begin with, which is the insight or the understanding. The universe does exist, but it clearly didn't have to. If you go back and say, but it does have to, it is the necessary being.
No, that only applies if that's our universe. That only
and I say it's clear it doesn't have to be a universe that has this bag in it, and has you in it, and has this glass in it.
No, that only applies to our universe. That only applies to our universe. Our universe could have been differently. But if by universe you mean reality, there is some part of reality that could not have been different. There is some necessary thing. And if you just mean universe as all of reality, it includes that thing.
If there's a part of reality, if you want to call God a part of reality that has to, okay, fine. But I think we've gone as far in that direction. Let's get back to it.
Yeah. So that's the part where, so atheists all agree there is a necessary foundation of reality that can't be, that is just the necessary thing. We all agree that none of us call it a God. And we don't think it needs to be a mind at all. Like minds can be emergent properties of physical things just fine.
Well, maybe, but I don't. Now here's the thing. You see, we're more than an hour, but I'm okay with it.
Yeah, I usually just said an hour is like a baseline. So
this is the reason why I, for example, think that God is not amoral. Okay, let's not forget mind, for example. If I think of God as the author of this universe, the universe is like a huge play. The world's a play, and the universe is like this great play or a novel, okay? God is the author of the novel. God conceived of the whole plot of the novel. Okay? That's the act of creation. God's conceiving of the plot of the universe down to its smallest detail, and God conferring reality upon it. Now, an author cannot conceive of a character who is in some way exceeds himself. That is, if you had an author I'm just making an analogy, if a human author had no sense of humor, he would not be able to write a book in which you had a character who had a riotously funny sense of humor, because the author is sort of lower than the character in that regard, because he lacks the sense of humor. A completely moronic author could not write a novel in which there was a brilliantly intelligent character saying brilliantly intelligent things. An author who was completely amoral, was like a psychopath, had no sense of right and wrong at all. Could not conceive a novel in which there were all sorts of interesting moral dilemmas and moral questions, in which you had very good characters and you have saintly characters and very wicked characters, because he'd be blind to all of those. How could he conceive of write a novel with characters who are sort of greater than he is? Now, this is not some sort of rigorous deduction, and I know you'll find atheists who deny it. Fine. You find atheists who deny it, and I can find you a lot of Catholic scientists or Catholic philosophers or Catholics who agree. This is not a question of opinion polls. I'm just telling you how I think. To me, it makes no sense to have the author of the universe sort of in some ontological sense lower than the character. I think God doesn't necessarily have a mind like ours. God is not a good person the way a human is a good person. God, in fact, that's not what the Catholic Church would say. It's not what theists would say. God isn't just a good person. God is goodness itself. But God, whatever he is above. He has more than we have. If God wrote a universe in which there are people who love, like a Mother Teresa, or pick your favorite person who exemplifies, selfless love, then God must be greater than that somehow, not less. That's why I believe that God is not some amoral, unconscious, dead thing. Now, you say, yes, matter gives rise to mind. Physics does not explain that, by the way. And I can quote you a very great physicist who say, physics does not explain even such a low level of mind as the consciousness of animals. Now, I think I could prove that to you if you give me a little more time. But
I can grant that. It also doesn't explain dark matter or dark energy yet. So physics.
No, not yet. I think by its very nature.
Well, I definitely would disagree with that for sure.
Okay. And I think because I could have a complete mathematical, give me a physical entity like a dog. I believe consciousness is a natural phenomenon. I believe that if you have neurons and stuff arranged in a certain way and so on, certain physical substrate, there will be consciousness as a natural consequence of that. I believe my dog died some months ago, but my dog Sparky, I believe he had conscious experience. I believe he had qualia, tastes and smells and stuff, and he is conscious. I believe that's a natural phenomenon. I don't believe it's a physics phenomenon. That is, I think physicalism is clearly wrong, because as a physical structure, as a collection of particles, subatomic particles and so forth, my dog was just a physical structure, which I believe is a completely mathematically describable structure. You could have, I believe, in principle, you can't in reality, but you could have a complete description, which would be a mathematical description, but you would have a complete description of the structure of my dog. Every neuron, every atom, every subatomic particle, everything. And if it's superstrings, whatever it is at the lowest level, you could have an exhaustive, complete description of the dog. And it would be mathematical in my view. That would not tell you, logically or mathematically imply that the dog had consciousness. It would, as a natural consequence, mean he had consciousness, but not as a consequence of the laws of physics and chemistry. I, though unreasonable to do so, I could simply say, I deny that my dog is conscious. I agree with Descartes. He's just an automaton. Yes, he barks. I can explain in physical terms all that. I can explain the physical chemical processes. I step on the cat's tail. I can say the nerve impulse went up. Its sensory nerves, it did stuff in the brain. Then something went down the motor nerves into its throat, and it screech, and all that's physical. Its scream is physical. It's stepping on its tail is physical. I can explain all that, but I deny that it has subjective conscious experience. And I would not be in any way, in doing so, inconsistent with the laws of physics and chemistry. The laws of physics and chemistry would not say that I was wrong.
Well, sure. I can do the same thing with the
There's
CD.
a level even of the physical world, including animal consciousness, which doesn't flow from physics. That's why I'm not a physicalist. But I think there are other elements of the world that also don't. But
yeah, let me just address that one. So I can take all the laws of physics and perfectly describe a CD and say, well, there's not Windows X or Windows 2007 on this CD, but I just be wrong. So
no, but what's on the CD is also mathematical structure. That is, whatever it is.
Well, it's a physical up and down of the ones and zeros.
It's the configuration of the matter there still.
Right, right. So exactly that's the thing, is I think that consciousness is a configuration in the matter, is a pattern in the electrical signals.
That makes no sense to me. And it's not just me, but I could quote atheists who also would say this. I do not see, in principle, how merely configure in those configurations of your CD or magnetic tape or whatever it is, those physical configurations are also mathematically describable. I could give you the values of various variables and stuff. I do not see how some configuration of matter gives rise to consciousness even, let alone free will, let alone reason. Now, it's a lot more easy for me to see how mind gives rise to matter than it is for me to see how matter, in the sense that physicists understand matter, gives rise to mind. And I'll tell you why. Because as I said before, when you start looking at matter at the deepest levels, and that's what electrons are, all you're left with is mathematically describable structure at the end of the day. And I can see how a mind could give rise to, think of a mathematical structure. I can think of mathematical structures. I can do math. I can sit here and start studying, the numbers system, real numbers or integers or geometrical structures. I can conceive of them and think about them. I can see how God or a mind could give rise to a thought, and in particular to mathematical thoughts. And it is mathematical thoughts that are the bedrock of physical reality. I do not see how a physical object gives rise to mind. So for me, yes, historically, in the history of the universe, mind appears on the scene very late. But I think mind is a fundamental reality. The reason it can flow out of the physical world the way it has when life appeared is because of some laws of nature, not purely physics laws, because physics won't get you there. The physics, as we've understood physics for the last 400 years, is rules, mathematical rules and equations. That's physics. Now, there could be some expanded super physics in the future that includes not just that, but somehow brings mind more directly into the picture. And so maybe. But right now, physics is mathematical rules and equations. I don't understand how that gives rise to minds.
Well, I
understand how a mind can give rise to physics.
Well, so I didn't get a chance to finish. So it's just an emergent property like any emergent property. Like, how does matter give rise to oceans? Well, I mean, if you just look at the matter, you'll never find the ocean there, because the ocean is a certain pattern in the matter and nothing more than just a pattern in the matter.
It's fundamentally different.
Well, no, I don't think it is. Most physics,
it's a fundamentally different kind of emergence, because it takes, the example, most people like these, like pressure in a gas. Pressure is an emergent. A single molecule, a single atom doesn't have pressure. It doesn't have temperature. Pressure is an emergent property, but when you analyze it, it can be analyzed down without remainder, without leaving anything out, into the behavior of individual molecules.
So can consciousness.
Saying that to say that the box of molecules has a certain pressure, you're talking about the average force per unit area of the molecules, the molecules exerting on the wall, or the temperature is a measure of sort of the average energy of the molecules. I can mathematically derive the fact that this gas has a pressure if you give me the complete microphysical description of the gas, not in terms of pressure, but in terms of where all the molecules, what all the individual molecules are doing. I can rigorously derive from that the temperature of what the temperature of the gas is and its pressure, if it's in equilibrium, what its temperature is, because I define temperature in a certain way that is it's derivable mathematically from the other.
So consciousness is the same.
Consciousness and is not mathematically derivable from the laws of physics and chemistry that way.
Well, that's what I'm saying is, yes, it is.
Properties of matter are.
No. So I'm saying consciousness is purely derivable, purely from the level of math, just like Windows XP is from CD.
No one can do it, and I think no one. I don't.
Well, no, that's the problem. Saying no one can do it now doesn't mean no one can do it. So, like, if I give you
faith, and let me quote somebody who is.
Well, I'm still trying to give I haven't given my analogy yet. So my analogy with the CD is like, if we look at a CD, you will not know if Windows is on it or if Mac is on it. Because you don't know, you can't look at the CD and know based off of the ones and zeros, which is the programming language. So there's no laws of physics. If I gave you all of the laws of physics, you would never know if it was Windows XP or if it was an Apple CD. But we put it in
nothing emerges from just the laws. Things emerge from a combination of the actual data, what you might call the initial conditions or some set of data.
What do you mean nothing?
Physical state. They're the laws, but that's not enough to tell you the physical state of anything.
Right, but there are things that definitely emerge from the laws.
Like the complete physical state of your CD, not just the laws of physics that govern it, but the actual complete physical description of its physical state, which would be where every molecule is in that state.
If I gave you all of that,
what you meant by various operating systems or computer languages or so forth, you defined those for me and said that any pattern that was, which was isomorphic to these zeros and ones or whatever, was this operating system or was this program. I could show you, yes, these things have that structure.
Yes, and we're going to discover that for consciousness too. That's what we're working on.
No, clearly not.
That's the consensus in every field of brain science, cognitive science, neurology. Every single one of them say this. All of the consensus say this.
That pure wish. It's not based upon it's not this, that's based entirely on intellectual prejudice. There's no rational basis for saying that. That's an act of pure faith.
Well, the evidence, the fact that we can.
Let me just quote a famous physicist to you who was not, I think, either an atheist. He doesn't describe himself as an atheist. He describes himself as a skeptical agnostic. And he said, he was asked, in an interview, I won't use his name, I don't want to embarrass him, but he is regarded by people in my field as probably the smartest physicist in the world. You might be able to guess who it is. But anyway, he was interviewed by some Swedish reporter or something, science reporter. He said, do you think we'll ever know all the laws of physics? And he says, I'm optimistic, I think it's very, very possible that we will know all the laws of physics at some point. He said, do you think anything will remain mysterious once we know all the laws of physics? And he listed about 4 or 5 things. And one of the things he said is consciousness. He said, I think that we will make great progress in understanding the workings of a conscious mind, of a conscious brain. And he's, I think, folk more or less imagining a human brain. And I think biologists will make great strides in understanding the workings of a conscious brain. I think maybe physicists will contribute to that. But I do not think but I think even if we understood completely the workings of a conscious brain, it would remain mysterious why what we call consciousness goes with those workings. And then he was asked to define consciousness, and he said, I'm not going to define it, and that's connected to the fact that I do not think consciousness is ever going to become part of physics. So I'm just saying, this is not a religious thing. This is a philosophical question in which people disagree. And it is certainly true that the great majority of philosophers, probably philosophers of mind and so on, would agree with you that it somehow will flow from physics and chemistry. I agree that it is natural, that consciousness is a natural consequence of certain physical processes, but it is not a consequence that flows from the laws of physics and chemistry, nor does it flow in some logical way from the simply arrangement of the atoms, in the way that you can say this arrangement of bits, however encoded on this CD or this magnetic tape, is a program. I mean, that follows from the definition of the program, and it follows from the configuration of the bits. It will not follow in any mathematical or logical way. It's a new kind of, and in the same way, in the physical world, we have things that are different from each other, and one thing can cause another. Take electromagnetism. There are electric fields and there are charged particles. They're not the same thing, and one is not reducible in any way to the other. They're quite distinct. And yet electric fields cause certain effects in the charged particles, and the charged particles cause certain effects in the electromagnetic fields. Those causes are described by equations. The effect of charged particles have on electromagnetic fields is described by Maxwell's equations. The effect that electromagnetic fields have on charged particles is described by the Lorentz force law. But they're distinct entities, neither reducible to the other. What I'm saying is I think consciousness is a reality. I'm talking about animal consciousness, is a natural reality. It's distinct from just stuff, particles and fields. I think there can be interactions between them. There are probably some natural law. Well, there are some laws, obviously, govern this. When certain physical structures are there, you have consciousness. And if you have other physical structures, there's not. And there seem to be patterns involved there. So I think there's some sort of psychophysical laws governing that, which are natural laws. But I just don't think that the consciousness is a physical thing governed by physics laws. It's another kind of reality, part of nature, but it's distinct.
Yeah, I'm going to have to just.
All I'm saying, there are plenty of people around who are atheists who would agree with that.
Sure, I'm going to have to get ready to go in about 8 minutes or so. But I think the biggest thing here in all of the points we've talked about is the distinction between the map and the territory. Like if you're trying to draw a map and it has exactly all of the same features as the territory, well then you've just literally just made a copy of the territory, the exact same size and everything. And in physics, the same thing applies to describing the material of the electron. Obviously, if we were going to make literally the copy of the material, we'd have to make the map the exact same as the territory. But we can't do that because it's just a language to describe the electron. And the same applies to consciousness. When we're making a model of consciousness mathematically, it's obviously not going to be the same as the consciousness, because then that would literally be the same thing as the territory. We're just making a representation to describe it. But it seems like the evidence that this is the case is simply the fact that we are able to make successful testable predictions about the brain, like knowing what people are going to choose before they choose it just by looking at brain states.
No, you don't know that. Are you thinking of the Libet experiment?
That's one of them, but there's more recent ones.
We're going to have an article on actually the Libet experiment has now been shown that the readiness potential that's building up in the brain is not simply the brain already having made the decision before the person is consciously aware of it. So you have to be a little bit careful here what you're saying. And I know this because there have been very important experiments done in recent years that have been widely reported, which show that the simplistic interpretation of Libet experiment is showing there's no free will is simply not cogent.
Oh, right. So free will, I think free will is logically impossible anyway, but I think there will definitely be a time
for a physical entity, which is why one reason I don't believe in physicalism.
Well, I think it's logically possible for a supernatural entity too, because
I don't think the human free will is supernatural. I also don't think it's purely physical. But there's a layer of our part of our universe. It's not just physical. And I think, well, if we have no free will, then in some sense, this whole discussion is kind of pointless, isn't it? And I would like to ask you, in case we ever get back together, which I would
absolutely, I'd love to chat again.
Well, I'd like to understand why it's important to you that people be atheists. I mean, that is
not.
No, that's not ad hominem in any way. I'm seriously wondering, because if I were an atheist, I would say, I don't care whether this guy over here believes in atheism. There were several reasons I might care. One is I might think, well, he's under a delusion to believe in God. And when you believe false things, it usually has bad negative consequences. You know, like That's why we evolved to be able to tell reality from fantasy. Because if you're living in a fantasy world, you're not going to see that. You're going to think that tiger that's about to eat you is just a figment of your imagination, and you're going to die. So there's a great survival value, and it certainly helps us flourish and have happy lives to live, to be aware of reality and distinguish it from fantasy. On the other hand, it's certainly true, I think, that many people are happier because they're religious. I think there are even studies that might show that that's untrue on the average. But it's not clear that by making someone who's religious believe an atheist, you make his life happier. It might have quite the opposite effect. Also, it can't be something beyond this life, because we're all just going to die and rot and disintegrate into our elements. So, there's no sort of long range reason why it matters whether this guy believes in God or not. If to the extent that it affects his temporal happiness in this world, there's strong arguments that actually maybe believing a falsehood often makes a person happier and live a more fulfilled, happy life. There are things that it might be better not for a person not to know. I mean, there might be some horrible truth about his parents that maybe you wouldn't want to tell him.
Yeah, I totally agree. People have.
Why is it important? I say because it's true, because truth matters. And I would say, but if we're all just a bunch of atoms in the void interacting according to these forces, we have no free will. Right and wrong, ultimately just a matter of chemical reactions going on in our brains and stuff. What is this vaunted truth, and why is it so damn important? So I just don't understand. I think deep down, you have values that truth is very important. Truth for its own sake. And that there's a right and wrong. And things that if you really thought hard about them, I think, you would realize that somehow this very threadbare physicalist picture of the world just doesn't get you there. It doesn't ground, it doesn't make reasonable some of the things you care about. It doesn't make reasonable the fact that you care about them to the extent that you do.
Well, my response to that would be, well, I don't really care what people believe. I'm just here to have interesting conversations. But I do value truth and reason and those things, but I think they are grounded just as reasonably if they're made of matter as if they're made of supernatural stuff. I don't think it doesn't make a difference what they're made of. I think their existence is valuable in and of themselves, regardless of whether or not they're material or supernatural. I don't think it makes a difference.
Amen. And amen. And I applaud the fact that you're a moral realist, because not everybody is. And the fact that I think there's a lot of common ground here, actually, on things that really matter. But anyway, I did most of the talking. But on the other hand, you have the whole show, so you can talk in hundreds of episodes, and this was my only chance.
Well, I'd love to have you on again and chat again. It was really fun talking to you. Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Okay, I enjoyed it a lot.